She was slapped in front of everyone, humiliated by the flight attendant, who saw her as just another nobody. But when the truth came out, the entire plane, and the airline itself, would never be the same again. The first-class cabin buzzed with quiet conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the hushed murmur of businessmen discussing deals worth millions. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle luxury of leather seats and polished wood. Every detail screamed exclusivity, a world reserved for those who could afford it. She stepped onto the plane without fanfare. No designer handbag, no flashy jewelry, just a simple black blazer over a crisp white blouse, paired with dark trousers and a pair of flats. To the untrained eye, she was just another business traveler, nothing extraordinary. That was exactly how she wanted it. Naomi Carter had built an empire from nothing. A self-made billionaire, she had taken the aviation industry by storm, acquiring stakes in multiple airlines, investing in cutting-edge technology, and, most recently, securing full ownership of this very airline. But she preferred to observe from the shadows, to understand the experience of her passengers without the filter of wealth and recognition. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, subtle but noticeable. The flight attendants greeted the passengers ahead of her with bright smiles and warm tones. But when their eyes landed on her, something changed. The polite smiles became tighter. The enthusiasm dimmed. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right section?" one of them asked, her tone professional but laced with doubt. Naomi didn't flinch. She simply handed over her boarding pass. The attendant scanned it, her eyebrows knitting together for a second, before she forced another smile. "Oh, 2A. That's unexpected." Naomi stepped forward, ignoring the lingering glances from a few nearby passengers, who had clearly overheard. She made her way to her seat, a spacious window-side spot with plush upholstery and ample legroom. As she settled in, she felt the weight of judgment around her, unspoken, yet heavy. Across the aisle, an older man in a tailored suit stole a glance at her before whispering something to his companion. A woman in a pearl necklace raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Naomi had seen this 1,000 times before. Then, a hushed voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am." Naomi turned slightly to see a junior flight attendant, a young woman barely in her 20s, hesitating as she leaned in. "I just wanted to say, I admire your work. You're Naomi Carter, aren't you?" Naomi smiled slightly but lifted a finger to her lips. "Let's keep that between us for now, all right?" The young woman nodded quickly, her eyes wide, but before she could say anything else, a sharp voice interrupted. "Cassandra, stop chatting and get back to work." The senior flight attendant was back, standing with her arms crossed, her gaze flicking between Naomi and the younger woman with thinly veiled irritation. Cassandra mumbled an apology and hurried away. Naomi exhaled quietly, shifting in her seat. The flight had barely begun, but she already knew this was going to be an interesting journey. The plane had reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines blended with the soft murmur of passengers ordering drinks, scrolling through their tablets, or adjusting their seats for a comfortable flight. Naomi Carter had barely taken a sip of her sparkling water when the tension in the air thickened. It started with a sharp voice. "You need to move." Naomi looked up. The senior flight attendant, the same one who had dismissed Cassandra earlier, now loomed over her. Her name tag read, Melissa Turner. The woman's expression was a mix of impatience and barely concealed irritation. Naomi remained composed. "I'm sorry." "This seat belongs to another passenger," Melissa snapped. "I don't know how you got here, but you need to move to economy." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Some turned to watch, others pretended not to listen, though their eyes darted over their magazines and screens. Naomi calmly placed her glass down. "I believe there's a misunderstanding. My boarding pass." "I don't care what's on your boarding pass." Melissa cut her off, voice tightening. "First class isn't for—" She hesitated, but the implication was loud enough. Naomi could hear the unspoken words beneath the surface. "People like you." The old man across the aisle chuckled under his breath. The pearl necklace woman gave Naomi a pointed glance, her lips pursing in disapproval. Naomi exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to react emotionally. She had encountered these situations before. Wealth didn't erase prejudice. Power didn't shield her from assumptions. Still, she remained calm. "I paid for this seat," she said evenly. "Or rather," she paused, considering her words carefully. "I own this seat." Melissa scoffed. "That's impossible. You're not even on the manifest." "I can assure you I am." The flight attendant's patience snapped. She reached down, grabbed Naomi's arm, and yanked. A collective gasp filled the cabin. Naomi tensed, every muscle in her body rigid with restraint. And then, it happened. The slap came fast, a sharp, stinging impact across Naomi's cheek, so sudden that for a moment, the entire first-class cabin froze. Silence. The sound of the impact echoed in Naomi's ears. Melissa stood there, hand trembling slightly, her own shock catching up with her actions. She hadn't meant to go that far. It was instinctive, an assertion of power. Someone audibly inhaled. A businessman clutched his phone tighter, uncertain whether to record or pretend he hadn't seen it. The old man in the tailored suit smirked. The woman in pearls let out a small gasp, but quickly composed herself, as if nothing had happened. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, inhaled through her nose, then exhaled. She tasted blood. Melissa swallowed hard. But before she could finish, Naomi stood up. Not in anger, not in fear, with the quiet, calculated grace of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. Melissa took a small step back, suddenly uncertain. "Security will remove you," she blurted out, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'll make sure of it." Naomi tilted her head, her lips curving into the faintest, most knowing smile. "Are you sure about that?" Her voice was calm, controlled, deadly. For the first time, Melissa hesitated. The silence stretched. The first-class cabin, once filled with quiet conversations and the occasional clink of glasses, had become a stage where everyone held their breath, waiting for the next move. Melissa's face was a mixture of defiance and unease. The red mark from her own slap was still visible on Naomi's cheek, but Naomi didn't reach up to touch it, didn't flinch. She simply stood there, composed, unreadable, dangerous in her stillness. A younger flight attendant, Cassandra, had been watching from the galley. Her eyes were wide with horror, her hand half raised as if she wanted to intervene, but didn't dare. Naomi's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "You just assaulted a passenger in front of an entire cabin of witnesses." Melissa's lips parted, then shut again. Her fingers curled into fists. "You were being disruptive," she snapped, but the conviction in her voice had weakened. Naomi arched a brow. "Was I?" The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A woman a few rows back pulled her phone out discreetly, the camera barely visible over the seat in front of her. "I'll call the captain," Melissa said finally, clinging to the last shred of her authority. "You'll be removed." Naomi exhaled through her nose, a quiet sound, almost amused. "You do that." Melissa turned sharply on her heel, stalking toward the cockpit, but Naomi wasn't watching her anymore. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her phone, and pressed a single button. The line rang twice before a deep male voice answered. "Ms. Carter?" Naomi's lips curved slightly. "Ground the flight." The reaction was immediate. Cassandra let out a small gasp. The businessman across the aisle, who had been watching with smug amusement, paled. The pearl necklace woman's mouth fell open slightly. Melissa froze mid-step. She turned back, blinking as if she had misheard. "Excuse me?" Naomi didn't acknowledge her. She was still on the phone, her tone even, unhurried. "Tell them I want all senior staff on the line in the next 5 minutes. This is a priority." The voice on the other end was quick. "Understood." Naomi hung up. Then she finally looked at Melissa again, and the power dynamic shifted so violently, it was almost tangible. Melissa's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Who exactly are you?" Naomi took a step closer. The hum of the plane's engines filled the space between them. "I own this airline." The weight of those 4 words crashed over Melissa like a tidal wave. Someone in the back of the cabin let out a quiet, "Oh my God." The businessman who had laughed earlier was now very still, his fingers tightening around his whiskey glass. The pearl necklace woman's posture had stiffened, her expression unreadable. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came out. A moment ago, she had been in control. She had been the authority. She had been untouchable. Now, she was nothing. Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if considering. "Go ahead," she invited. "You were about to have me removed, weren't you?" Melissa's face burned red. Her gaze flickered toward Cassandra, toward the other passengers, all of whom were now waiting, watching. The curtain between first class and economy rustled, and then another figure stepped in. The captain. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, his uniform crisp and immaculate. His eyes immediately darted between Naomi and Melissa, taking in the tension, the way Melissa stood rigid, the way Naomi remained impossibly calm. "What's going on here?" he asked, but his voice lacked true authority, because something in the air had already shifted. Naomi turned to him and smiled. "Captain, I believe you're about to receive a call." Almost on cue, his cockpit radio crackled. The captain hesitated before bringing it to his ear. He listened for exactly 10 seconds. Then, his face drained of color. He looked at Naomi with a new understanding, then at Melissa, his expression darkening. "Ms. Carter," he said, clearing his throat, "is there anything we can do to rectify this situation?" The color in Melissa's face vanished. Naomi let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then she exhaled and shook her head lightly. "No need," she said, voice smooth. "I'd just like to know one thing." Melissa was still frozen, barely breathing. Naomi tilted her head, her eyes steady. "Why did you assume I didn't belong here?" The words weren't loud, but they cut deeper than the slap ever could. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. The question hung in the air, suffocating, inescapable. Naomi hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened. She had simply asked. And yet, the weight of it pressed down on Melissa with unbearable force. I didn't," Melissa stammered, her voice weaker now, stripped of its authority. "I thought there was a mistake." Naomi's gaze remained steady. "A mistake," she echoed. The entire cabin was silent. The passengers who had sneered at her before now sat rigid, eyes darting between her and Melissa. The businessman clutched his drink tighter, the pearl necklace woman no longer meeting Naomi's eyes. The captain took a step forward, his tone now clipped and professional. "Ms. Carter, I deeply apologize on behalf of the airline." Naomi lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Apologies are easy," she said. "Understanding takes effort." The captain hesitated, then nodded slowly. Melissa, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face twisted in frustration, in shame, in the realization that her world was crumbling around her. "Please," she tried again, voice desperate now. I didn't know who you were." Naomi's lips curled into the faintest, coldest smile. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Melissa paled. The meaning was clear. Had Naomi looked different, dressed differently, been someone else entirely? Would Melissa have treated her the same way? The truth was written all over her face. Cassandra, the young flight attendant who had recognized Naomi from the start, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted toward Melissa, then back at Naomi, as if debating whether to say something. But she didn't need to. The silence was already speaking volumes. The captain's radio crackled again. He lifted it to his ear, listened briefly, then straightened. His next words sent shockwaves through the cabin. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "corporate has advised that we are to deplane the individual responsible for this incident." Melissa's head snapped up. "What?" The businessman sucked in a breath. The pearl necklace woman audibly gasped. Naomi simply watched as the reality of the situation crashed down on Melissa. "You can't be serious," Melissa said, her voice rising in pitch. She turned to the captain, to the passengers, to anyone who would meet her gaze. "This is my job, my career. I didn't mean—" No one came to her defense. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You were so eager to remove me," she murmured. "Now it's your turn." Melissa staggered back, as if physically struck. Cassandra finally spoke up, her voice hesitant but firm. "I'll escort her out, Captain." The captain nodded solemnly. "Please do." Melissa turned to Naomi one last time, desperate. But Naomi had already looked away. She took her seat again, adjusting her blazer, lifting her glass of sparkling water, as if nothing had happened at all. And as Melissa Turner was escorted off the plane, her career in ruins, Naomi Carter took a slow sip, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. Power wasn't in raising your voice. It wasn't in fighting back. It was in knowing that the moment you spoke, the world listened. The hush in the first-class cabin lingered long after Melissa had been led away. Passengers who had once whispered behind Naomi's back now avoided her gaze entirely. The businessman who had smirked at her discomfort sat stiffly in his seat, eyes locked on the screen in front of him, though he hadn't pressed play on the movie. The woman in pearls had gone pale, twisting the necklace between her fingers, her previous arrogance replaced with unease. Cassandra, now standing near Naomi's seat, swallowed hard. "Ms. Carter, I just want to say, I'm so sorry for what happened." Naomi finally looked up, her gaze softer now. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said simply. The young woman hesitated, then nodded. But there was something else in her eyes. Relief. Because she had witnessed something that rarely happened in this world. Justice, swift and undeniable. The captain returned, adjusting his uniform with careful precision. "Ms. Carter, we are prepared to continue with the flight, if there's anything else you need." Naomi studied him for a moment. He was careful now, every word measured, every movement respectful. She could feel it in the air. The weight of what had just happened would not be forgotten. She exhaled lightly, then gave a small nod. "Let's take off." The captain inclined his head and returned to the cockpit. As the plane began its slow taxi down the runway, Naomi felt the shift, not just in the aircraft, but in the very foundation of the moment. A lesson had been taught. A message had been sent. And as she gazed out the window, watching the ground disappear beneath them, she smiled ever so slightly. Melissa Turner had believed she held power. But real power was never about position. It was about presence. The plane soared above the clouds, the tension of the last hour now a distant memory. But for those who had witnessed it, this was not something they would easily forget. Naomi took a final sip of her drink, setting the glass down with quiet precision. The world around her had shifted, not because she had demanded respect, but because she had commanded it. Cassandra passed by, pausing briefly. "I hope we'll see you on another flight, Ms. Carter." Naomi smiled. "That depends. Will the service be better next time?" Cassandra let out a nervous chuckle, but then saw the amusement in Naomi's eyes. She smiled back, a genuine one this time, before continuing down the aisle. A few rows away, the businessman who had laughed at Naomi earlier hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter." She turned her head slightly, but her expression gave nothing away. He struggled, then simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something he didn't have the words for. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. As the plane cruised toward its destination, she leaned back into her seat, exhaling softly. Respect isn't given, it's taken. And today, she hadn't just taken it. She had made sure they would never forget why she deserved it. If you've ever seen or experienced a moment like this, tell us in the comments below. What would you have done in Naomi's place? And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.